Commander Olin Keth had faced down asteroid pirates, navigated diplomatic crises between 3 warring species, and once talked a sentient black hole out of consuming an entire star system. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this particular brand of chaos. 12 fox-like Nethak cubs who had decided that sleep was apparently optional for the past 3 rotations. "Commander," the voice belonged to Technician Vel 9, one of the mechanoids who ran environmental systems on Kepler-4, 42b research station. Even through the artificial vocal processors, Olan could detect what passed for panic in a being made of circuits and synthetic emotion matrices. "The Cubs are at it again, sir. They've somehow managed to activate the emergency lighting in Section C, using their tails." Olan's elongated ears flattened against his skull, a sure sign that his legendary patience was wearing thinner than the atmosphere on a dying moon. His species, the Nithak, were known throughout the galaxy for their calm demeanor and logical problem-solving abilities. They were the diplomatic peacekeepers, the ones other species called when situations required a steady hand and an even steadier mind. Right now, Olin felt about as steady as a supernova having an identity crisis. "How?" he began, his voice carrying that particular tone that suggested someone was about to get a lecture on physics, biology, and basic common sense. "Does a juvenile Nethak activate emergency lighting with their tail?" "Well, sir," Vel 9's optical sensors dimmed slightly, the mechanoid equivalent of looking embarrassed. "They've been chewing through the access panels. Apparently, when their saliva makes contact with the bioresponsive circuits." "Of course it does." Olin pinched the bridge of his snout, a gesture he'd been making so frequently over the past 3 days that he was developing a permanent indent. "And where are they now?" "Docking Bay 4, sir. Still. That one word contained multitudes of frustration. The Cubs had been camping out in Docking Bay 4 for 3 rotations now, ever since they'd first started this inexplicable behavior. They would venture out for food, water, and the occasional bout of creative destruction, but they always returned to that specific bay. They'd arranged themselves in a semicircle facing the massive viewport that looked out into space, occasionally whimpering at something only they could perceive. Olan made his way through the station's corridors, noting the telltale signs of sleep-deprived crew members. The crystalline beings were flickering more than usual, a sure sign of fatigue in their species. The gaseous Anthropians had condensed into tighter, more agitated forms. Even the usually unflappable mechanoids were moving with jerky, inefficient motions that suggested their processing cores were overworked. The cross-species integration program had seemed like such a brilliant idea 6 months ago. Take cubs from various species, raise them together in a controlled environment, and create the next generation of truly integrated galactic citizens. The project had attracted funding from 12 different stellar governments and the enthusiastic support of the Galactic Council for Interspecies Cooperation. Nobody had mentioned that it might involve sleepless nights and emergency lighting being used as chew toys. Olin entered Docking Bay 4 and was immediately greeted by a scene that would have been endearing if it weren't so utterly baffling. 12 small, fox-like forms with silver-tipped fur and impossibly large eyes had arranged themselves in perfect formation. They were all facing the viewport, their heads tilted at identical angles, their ears perked and alert. They looked like they were waiting for something. "All right, you little menaces," Olan said, crouching down to their level. "What's this all about?" 12 pairs of luminous golden eyes turned toward him in perfect synchronization. If it had been a military unit, Olin would have been impressed. Since it was a group of cubs who should have been napping, playing, and generally acting like normal juveniles, it was frankly unnerving. The largest of the cubs, a female they'd named Kira, before realizing she was more stubborn than a neutron star, padded over to him and placed one small paw on his knee. She made a soft, chittering sound, then turned back toward the viewport and released what could only be described as the most heartbroken whimper in the known galaxy. I know, Olan said, though he absolutely did not know. But whatever you're waiting for isn't coming. The docking schedule is clear for the next 2 rotations. The only ship expected is a human supply transport, and that's been delayed by solar storms in the Proxima sector. At the mention of the human ship, all 12 cubs suddenly became more alert. Their ears pricked up, their tails began swishing in agitated patterns, and they started making soft, chittering sounds to each other. "Oh, come on," Olan muttered. "You can't possibly be waiting for a human supply ship. Humans are... well, they're humans. They're pleasant enough, in their own chaotic way, but there's nothing particularly special about them. They're average in strength, average in intelligence, average in pretty much every measurable category, except their alarming tendency to form emotional attachments to inanimate objects, and their bizarre insistence on putting cheese on everything." The cubs were not impressed by this logical assessment. If anything, their chittering became more insistent. Olan's communicator chirped, and Dr. Mero Sindal's voice filled the bay. The vegan xenopsychologist sounded about as frazzled as a being with natural telepathic abilities could sound without broadcasting his stress to every sensitive species within a 3-sector radius. "Commander, I've run every test I can think of. Pheromone analysis, neurological scans, behavioral pattern mapping, even that. New quantum consciousness detector the Aldebaran Institute sent over. These cubs are exhibiting classic pre-bonding behavior, but there's no appropriate bonding target present." "Pre-bonding behavior?" Olan asked, though he suspected he wasn't going to like the answer. "In simple terms, they've identified someone as a potential pack leader or parental figure. The problem is, there's no one here who fits their psychological profile. I've tested every adult on the station: Nithak, Mechanoid, Crystalline, Entropian, even the 3 vegans in the botany department. Nothing. These cubs are looking for someone specific, and that someone isn't here." Olan looked down at the cubs, who were now staring at him with expressions that somehow managed to be both hopeful and accusatory. "And you have no idea who they're looking for?" "Well..." Mero's voice took on that tone that scientists used when they were about to say something that sounded completely insane but was backed by rigorous data. "Based on their positioning, their directional focus, and the specific frequency of their vocalizations, I believe they're waiting for the delayed human transport." Silence filled the docking bay. Even the cubs seemed to be holding their breath. "Dr. Sindal," Olan said slowly, "are you suggesting the 12 Nithak cubs have somehow developed a psychic connection to a human they've never met, who is currently somewhere in the Proxima sector dealing with solar storms?" "I'm suggesting," Mero replied, with the careful precision of someone who knew how ridiculous he sounded, "that we don't know nearly as much about interspecies psychological bonding as we thought we did." Olan looked out the viewport at the star-filled darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, a human pilot was fighting solar winds and electromagnetic interference, probably cursing his luck and wondering why supply runs always seemed to go sideways. That same pilot had no idea that 12 alien cubs were refusing to sleep until he arrived. The universe, Olan reflected, had a truly twisted sense of humor. "When is the human transport expected?" he asked. "The Meridian's edge should arrive within the next rotation, assuming Captain Holloway can navigate through the solar storm interference." Captain Holloway. Even the name sounded unremarkable. Olan had dealt with human transport pilots before. They were usually practical, no-nonsense individuals who wanted to complete their deliveries and move on to the next job. They weren't the type to inspire mysterious psychological bonding in alien cubs. One of the smaller cubs, a male with particularly expressive eyes, approached Olan and began a complex series of chirps and trills. The sounds were unlike anything in the normal Nithak cub vocal repertoire. "What's he saying?" Olan asked his communicator. I'm not sure," Mero admitted. "The vocalizations don't match any known Nithak communication patterns. It's almost like he's trying to speak in a language he doesn't actually know." "Which language?" "Based on the phonetic structure, I think he's trying to speak Standard Galactic. Badly." Olan stared at the cub, who was now looking at him with an expression of intense concentration, clearly struggling to communicate something important. "You're trying to tell me something about the human, aren't you?" The cub's tail wagged, a behavior that was decidedly not typical for Nithak cubs, who usually expressed approval through ear positioning and soft purring sounds. "Commander," Velnine's voice crackled through the bay's communication system. "I'm picking up a ship on long-range sensors. It's the Meridian's edge. Captain Holloway has cleared the solar storms and is requesting docking permission." All 12 cubs suddenly leaped to their feet, their entire bodies vibrating with excitement. They pressed against the viewport, their noses leaving small fog patterns on the transparent aluminum surface. Olin felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the station's environmental systems. "Tell Captain Holloway he's cleared for docking in Bay 4. And Dr. Sindel?" "Yes, Commander." "I want you down here when he arrives. Something tells me we're about to get some answers." As the Meridian's edge grew larger in the viewport, Olin couldn't shake the feeling that this simple supply run was about to become something much more complicated. The cubs had stopped whimpering. For the first time in 3 rotations, they looked content. Whatever was about to happen, Olin had the distinct impression that his orderly, logical universe was about to be turned completely upside down by one unremarkable human and 12 very remarkable cubs who somehow knew he was coming. Captain Mace Holloway stepped off the Meridian's edge, looking exactly like what Central Casting would order if they needed gruff space pilot number 3 for a low-budget adventure film. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the kind of practiced indifference that came from years of dealing with bureaucratic cargo manifests and malfunctioning life support systems. His gray-streaked beard was precisely trimmed. His uniform was regulation clean but worn at the edges, and his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. What he wasn't expecting was to be immediately swarmed by 12 ecstatic fox-like aliens who acted as though he'd just returned from a successful campaign to save the universe. "What the—" Mace took a step back as the cubs surrounded him, their tails wagging with enough enthusiasm to generate a small windstorm. They were making soft, chittering sounds and attempting to climb up his legs like furry, determined mountaineers tackling their first peak. Commander Olin Keth watched this scene with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for natural disasters or political debates. In all his cycles of commanding the research station, he had never seen the cubs react to anyone with this level of immediate, overwhelming affection. "Captain Holloway, I presume?" Olin approached carefully, as though sudden movements might spook whatever cosmic forces were at work here. "I'm Commander Keth. Welcome to Kepler 442b Research Station, and, well, I apologize for the welcoming committee." Mace looked down at the small alien faces gazing up at him with expressions of pure adoration. One of the cubs had managed to wrap itself around his left leg and was purring like a tiny organic engine. "Are they supposed to be doing this?" "Because I've got to tell you, Commander, I just haul cargo. I'm not exactly the warm and fuzzy type." "That's actually part of the problem," Olin admitted. "These cubs haven't slept in 3 rotations. They've been waiting in this docking bay, apparently for you specifically, and we have absolutely no idea why." "For me?" Mace's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Look, I've never been to this station before. I've never seen these— what are they, anyway?" "Nithak cubs. And no, you haven't met them before. That's what makes this so—" Olin paused, searching for the right word. "Unprecedented." Dr. Mero Sindal materialized beside them with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of unobtrusive observation. The Vegan was tall and willowy, with the kind of pale, ethereal features that made humans instinctively want to offer him sunscreen and a good meal. His large, dark eyes were fixed on the scene before him with scientific fascination. "Remarkable," Mero murmured, pulling out a small scanning device. "Captain, would you mind if I took some readings? The cub's neural activity is off the charts." "Scan away, Doc," Mace said, though he was starting to look slightly overwhelmed by the attention. Can someone explain why these little guys are acting like I'm their long-lost father?" "If we could explain it," Olin said dryly, "we probably wouldn't be having this conversation." As Mero ran his scans, something extraordinary happened. The cubs, as if responding to some invisible signal, began to settle down. Not just physically, though they did stop their enthusiastic climbing expedition, but their entire energy seemed to shift. The frantic, desperate edge that had characterized their behavior for 3 rotations simply disappeared. Within moments, they had arranged themselves in a neat circle around Mace's feet and, one by one, began to curl up for what was obviously going to be a nap. "Well," Olin said faintly, "that's new." Mace looked down at the sleeping cubs, then back up at the 2 alien scientists who were staring at him like he'd just performed a miracle involving the fundamental laws of physics. "Okay, seriously, What is going on here? That, Marrow said, his voice filled with the kind of awe usually reserved for discovering new forms of life or particularly impressive explosions, is what we've been trying to figure out. Over the next few hours, Mace found himself subjected to what could generously be called a comprehensive scientific investigation, and what could more accurately be described as barely organized chaos with measuring instruments. Dr. Sindal ran every scan known to vegan science, plus a few he'd apparently invented on the spot. Technician Vel 9 analyzed the air composition around Mace for unusual pheromones. The station's crystalline xenobiologist attempted to measure his life frequency, whatever that meant. Through it all, the cubs remained peacefully asleep in a neat ring around wherever Mace happened to be standing. "This is insane," Mace muttered as Dr. Sindel waved yet another scanning device in his general direction. "I'm just a cargo pilot. I haul supplies from point A to point B. I avoid pirates and tax collectors, and I try not to get killed by malfunctioning hyperdrives. There's nothing special about me." "According to my scans," Marrow said, studying his readings with the intense focus of someone solving a particularly complex puzzle, "you're absolutely correct. Your physiological readings are well within human normal parameters. Your pheromone output is typical for your species. Your neural activity shows standard patterns for an adult human male experiencing mild stress and considerable confusion." "Then why?" Mace gestured at the sleeping cubs. "This?" "That," Olan interjected, "is the million-credit question." They tried separation tests. The moment Mace moved more than 10 meters away from the cubs, they woke up and began the heartbroken whimpering that had tormented the station for 3 rotations. When he returned, they settled back down immediately. They tried having other humans communicate with the cubs via subspace link. The cubs showed polite interest, but no special reaction. They had Mace's voice played through speakers while he was in another section of the station. The cubs remained alert, but calm, apparently able to distinguish between his live presence and a recording. "It's not species-specific," Marrow concluded after the 3rd hour of testing. "It's not pheromone-based. It's not even necessarily related to direct physical proximity, since they seem to sense when you're nearby, but not in the same room." "So, what is it?" Mace asked. He was sitting on the floor now, partly because the cubs seemed to prefer it when he was at their level, and partly because he was getting tired of standing while various aliens pointed scientific instruments at him. "I have a theory," Marrow said carefully, "but you're not going to like it. Doc, at this point, I'm ready to believe in telepathic space magic if it explains why 12 alien cubs think I'm their favorite person in the galaxy." "It's not telepathy," Marrow said. "At least, not in the traditional sense. But I think they're responding to something in your neural signature, something that marks you as what their instincts recognize as a survivor protector." Olan's ears perked up. "A what now?" "It's a concept from early Nithak evolutionary psychology. In the wild, Nithak cubs instinctively seek out adult figures who have survived significant trauma and lived to protect others. It's an adaptive behavior. Cubs who could identify the most capable protectors had better survival rates." Mace was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. One of the cubs had rolled over in its sleep and was now using his boot as a pillow. "And you think these cubs are picking up on something like that in me?" "Your neural patterns show traces of significant past trauma," Marrow said gently, "but also evidence of recovery, adaptation, and what I can only describe as deeply ingrained protective instincts. To put it simply, Captain, your brain carries the signature of someone who has been through hell and came out the other side with an intact desire to keep others safe." The docking bay fell silent, except for the soft sound of 12 cubs breathing in perfect synchronization. "Combat medic," Mace said finally. "Frontier wars, 10 cycles ago. Lost a lot of good people. Saved a few, too." He looked down at the sleeping cubs, something shifting in his expression. "You're telling me these little guys can somehow sense that?" "I'm saying," Marrow replied, "that they've identified you as exactly the kind of person their species has evolved to trust with their lives." Commander Olin watched this exchange with growing fascination and a healthy dose of concern for his station's operational status. "Captain Holloway, I don't suppose you'd consider extending your stay?" "Just until we can figure out a more permanent solution to this situation." Mace looked up at him sharply. How permanent are we talking here, Commander? Well, Olan said, trying to project more confidence than he felt. The cubs are part of a long-term integration program. They'll be here for at least another 6 months while we study interspecies social development. And given their apparent attachment to you, you want me to play alien babysitter for 6 months. I want, Olan said carefully, to ensure that these cubs develop properly and don't disrupt station operations any further. And it appears that you are the key to both of those objectives. Mace was quiet for several minutes, absently stroking the head of the cub that had claimed his boot. The small alien made a contented sound and snuggled closer. I'll think about it, he said finally. But first, I've got cargo to unload and a schedule to keep. These little guys are going to have to learn that their new favorite human has a job to do. As if responding to his words, all 12 cubs opened their eyes simultaneously and looked up at him with expressions that clearly conveyed the message, "We'll wait." Commander Olin had the sinking feeling that his orderly research station was about to become something entirely different, and that Captain Mace Holloway, whether he realized it or not, was about to become the most important human in this corner of the galaxy. The cubs, meanwhile, had apparently decided that the long wait was over. They were finally ready to sleep properly, as long as their human stayed where they could keep an eye on him. 3 days later, Captain Mace Holloway was beginning to understand why some species had developed the concept of karma, and why it apparently had a sense of humor darker than a black hole's event horizon. He'd planned to unload his cargo, file his delivery reports, and be back in hyperspace within 18 hours. Instead, he was sitting in the station's primary research lab, surrounded by enough scientific equipment to outfit a small university, while Dr. Mero Sindel explained why 12 alien cubs had turned his simple supply run into what was rapidly becoming the most studied case of interspecies psychology in galactic history. The neural mapping is quite fascinating, Mero was saying, manipulating a three-dimensional holographic display that showed Mace's brain activity in real time. Your amygdala shows classic adaptation patterns consistent with post-traumatic stress recovery, but what's remarkable is the overlay of what we're calling protective resonance in your prefrontal cortex. Doc, Mace said, with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that scientists loved their jargon, pretend I failed xenoneurology and explain it in words a cargo pilot can understand. Your brain, Commander Olin interjected from where he was observing the proceedings, has been rewired by experience, not just damaged, rebuilt. The cubs can somehow sense that rebuilding process. It's more specific than that, Mero continued, clearly excited by his findings. Captain, could you tell us more about your military service? The specifics might help us understand why the cubs are responding so strongly. Mace was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as though he was chewing through memories that didn't taste particularly good. Through the lab's observation window, they could see the 12 cubs arranged in their now familiar semicircle, all facing toward the lab, where their chosen human was sitting. Frontier Wars, he said finally. Combat medic with the 42nd Independent Transport Division. We ran supplies to forward bases, evacuated wounded, did search and rescue when things went sideways. His voice took on the flat, matter-of-fact tone that veterans used when discussing events that were anything but matter-of-fact. Lost my transport in the Battle of Kepler, 186. Spent 3 days in a crashed ship with 6 wounded crew members, no power, and hostile forces closing in. And, Mero prompted gently, and I kept them alive until the cavalry showed up. Lost 2 good friends in that crash, but I got the other 4 home to their families. Mace's hands unconsciously clenched and unclenched. Did my job, got my medals, took my discharge, and started hauling cargo because space is big and mostly empty, and you don't have to worry about other people, depending on you to keep them breathing. The lab fell silent except for the soft hum of scientific equipment and the distant sound of 12 cubs beginning their evening meal in perfect synchronization. That's it, Mero breathed, his eyes wide with the kind of excitement that scientists got when the universe suddenly made sense in an entirely new way. Captain, you're not just a survivor. You're someone who survived specifically to protect others. Your neural patterns don't just show recovery from trauma. They show active, ongoing protective programming. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning, Commander Olin said slowly, pieces clicking into place in his methodical mind. That you've essentially trained your brain to be constantly alert for threats to those under your protection. The cubs aren't just sensing that you're a survivor, they're sensing that you're a guardian. Dr. Sindel was practically bouncing with scientific enthusiasm. It explains everything. Nighthack cubs in the wild face, constant threats from predators, environmental hazards, and resource scarcity. Their survival depends on identifying adults who won't just survive themselves, but who will actively protect the pack's vulnerable members. But these cubs were raised in captivity, Mace pointed out. They've never faced those kinds of threats. No, but the instinct is hardwired into their species' evolutionary psychology, Merrow explained. What's remarkable is that they can detect these protective qualities across species barriers. Your neural signature is broadcasting safe adult, who will die before letting harm come to those in his care. And that's a signal that transcends biological differences. As if to emphasize the point, one of the cubs, the small male who had tried to communicate in Standard Galactic, pressed his face against the observation window and made a series of soft, chittering sounds clearly directed at Mace. He's saying, "Thank you," Merrow translated, consulting his xenolinguistic database. At least, that's the closest standard equivalent. "Thank you for what?" Mace asked, though something in his chest was doing uncomfortable acrobatics. "For being exactly what they needed you to be." Commander Olin cleared his throat, a sound that carried the weight of administrative decisions and budgetary considerations. "Captain Holloway, I'm going to make you an offer. The Cubs clearly need you, and frankly, your presence has solved what was becoming a serious operational crisis. I'd like to offer you a position as the Cubs' primary caretaker. Commander, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not exactly nursery material." "That's where you're wrong," Merrow interjected. "You're precisely nursery material, at least for these 12 individuals. They've bonded with you in a way that transcends normal interspecies interaction. Separating them from you now could cause significant psychological damage." Mace looked through the observation window at the Cubs, who were now all staring back at him with expressions of patient hope. What would this job actually involve? "Officially, you'd be the interspecies integration specialist for the Nithac development program," Olin replied. "Unofficially, you'd be making sure they eat their vegetables, don't chew through any more access panels, and grow up to be productive members of galactic society. And the pay? Competitive, plus full benefits, station housing, and the knowledge that you're contributing to one of the most important xenobiological studies in recent history." Mace was quiet for several minutes, watching the Cubs watch him. The largest female, the one Olin had mentioned was particularly stubborn, was making soft, encouraging sounds, as though she could sense the internal debate happening behind the observation window. "There's something else," Mace said finally. "Something I haven't told you about those 3 days in the crashed transport." Both aliens waited, recognizing the tone of someone about to share something significant. The youngest crew member was 19, kid named Tommy Chen, barely old enough to vote, let alone serve on a frontier transport. Got pinned under debris when we crashed. Internal bleeding. Probably wasn't going to make it. Mace's voice grew quieter. "I stayed with him for 18 hours, kept pressure on his wounds, told him stories about home, promised him he was going to see his family again." "Did he survive?" Merrow asked gently. "He did. Married his childhood sweetheart 6 months after we got back. Has 2 kids now, last I heard." Mace's hands unclenched slightly. "But here's the thing, Doc. Those 18 hours, keeping that kid alive, talking him through the pain and the fear, that wasn't just medical training. That was personal. Like something in my brain rewired itself to make sure no one under my watch would die, alone and scared. And now," Olan said with growing understanding, 12 Cubs have identified you as someone who won't let them face their fears alone. Apparently, Mace stood up abruptly, startling the monitoring equipment. "I need to think about this. Can you give me 24 hours? "Of course. But Captain?" Olan's voice carried a note of gentle urgency. "The Cubs haven't eaten properly since you've been in the lab. They're waiting for you." Through the observation window, they could indeed see that 12 small meals sat untouched, while 12 pairs of golden eyes remained fixed on the lab's entrance. "Right," Mace sighed. I guess I should go, let them know I haven't abandoned them. As he headed toward the door, Dr. Sindel called out, Captain? For what it's worth, I think the Cubs chose well. Not everyone who survives trauma becomes a protector. Most people who go through what you experienced would focus on protecting themselves. The fact that your instinct is to protect others, that's remarkable. Mace paused at the doorway. Doc, I've spent 10 cycles trying to avoid exactly that kind of responsibility. These Cubs are asking me to take on 12 more lives to worry about. No, Marrow said softly. They're asking you to do what you've always done. The only difference is that this time, the ones you're protecting know exactly how valuable you are. As Mace left the lab and walked toward 12 very patient, very hungry Cubs, Commander Olin turned to his xenopsychologist colleague with a bemused expression. Think he'll accept? I think, Dr. Sindel replied, watching through the window as 12 Cubs immediately brightened at the sight of their chosen guardian. That he already has. He just hasn't admitted it to himself yet. Outside in the corridor, they could hear the sound of Mace's voice, rough but gentle, telling the Cubs that it was time for dinner, and that everything was going to be all right. For the first time in days, Commander Olin allowed himself to believe that might actually be true. Captain Mace Holloway stood in the docking bay at 0300 station time, staring at the meridian's edge and trying to convince himself that walking away was still an option. The ship looked smaller than usual, somehow, as though the past week had changed his perspective on everything, including the vessel that had been his home for the past 3 cycles. Behind him, 12 Cubs slept in their characteristic semicircle, finally at peace because their chosen guardian was exactly where they could sense him. The irony wasn't lost on Mace that he was contemplating abandoning the first beings in years who had looked at him and seen exactly what he was, someone who couldn't walk away from those who needed protection. Having second thoughts? Commander Olin's voice carried across the bay with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to read people across species barriers. Third and fourth thoughts, actually, Mace replied without turning around. I came here to drop off medical supplies and spare parts. I wasn't planning to adopt 12 alien kids. In my experience, Olin said, settling down beside the Cubs with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent the week learning their individual personalities. The most important decisions are the ones we never planned to make. The bay's main doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Dr. Marrow Sindel entered, carrying what appeared to be a steaming mug and a thick data pad. His usually pristine appearance was rumpled in the way that suggested he'd been working through the night again. Couldn't sleep either? Marrow asked, offering Mace the mug. It's coffee. Human coffee. I had the replicators analyze your ship's stores. Mace accepted the drink with a grunt of appreciation. Real coffee was a luxury in space, and the fact that the station's xenobiologist had taken the time to replicate it properly said something about the Vegan's observational skills. I've been reviewing the long-term projections for the Cubs' development, Marrow continued, settling cross-legged beside Olin. If they maintain their current bonding patterns with you, we could be looking at the first successful case of cross-species pack integration in galactic history. And if I leave? Honestly? Unknown. They might adapt eventually, but the psychological trauma could set back their development by months or even cycles. And there's another consideration. Mace raised an eyebrow, a gesture that had somehow become more expressive over the past week. Which is, you're not the only one who's been affected by this bonding, Marrow said carefully. The Cubs aren't just dependent on you. You've been exhibiting classic protective pack behavior toward them. Your stress levels spike when they're out of visual range. Your sleep patterns have synchronized with theirs. Whether you realize it or not, Captain, they've become your pack as much as you've become their guardian. The observation hit Mace with the uncomfortable accuracy of a precision-guided truth missile. He had been checking on the Cubs every few hours, had found himself automatically counting heads when they moved as a group, had actually felt his heart rate increase when one of the smaller ones had wandered too close to a maintenance shaft the previous day. That's not necessarily a bad thing, Olan added quietly. Some of the other species on the station have been watching your interactions with the Cubs. The crystalline beings find your patience instructive. The mechanoids have been analyzing your problem-solving techniques. Even the Anthropians have expressed interest in your emotional flexibility. Meaning what? Meaning, Commander Olin said with a slight smile, that you've accidentally become something of a celebrity among the station's xenobiological community. Not just as the human who bonded with Nithak cubs, but as someone who demonstrates effective interspecies leadership principles. A soft, chittering sound from the sleeping cubs drew their attention. The largest female, who had earned the nickname Mother Hen from the station staff due to her tendency to organize the other cubs, had shifted in her sleep and was now resting one small paw on Mace's boot. "She does that every night," Mace said, his voice softer than it had been moments before. "Takes roll call, makes sure everyone's accounted for, then claims the closest position to me." "Natural pack leadership," Marrow observed. "She's identified you as the Alpha Protector and positioned herself as your lieutenant. It's remarkably sophisticated social behavior for cubs their age." Mace was quiet for several minutes, absently stroking the small alien's head while she slept. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had made a decision that surprised even himself. "If I stay, and I'm not saying I will, it can't just be about babysitting duties." "What do you mean?" Olan asked. "I mean these cubs are going to grow up in a galaxy that's not always kind to beings who are different. If they're going to integrate successfully with other species, they need to understand how to deal with challenges that go beyond theoretical social development." Mace stood up carefully, trying not to disturb the sleeping cubs. "I've been watching the other species on this station. The crystalline beings are brilliant, but fragile. The mechanoids are logical, but inflexible. The Anthropians are adaptable, but unpredictable. And the Vegans," he glanced at Marrow with a slight grin, "are wise, but tend to overthink everything." "And humans?" Olin prompted. "Humans are stubborn, emotional, illogical problem solvers who specialize in finding solutions that shouldn't work, but somehow do." Mace's expression grew more serious. "These cubs are going to need those skills. Not just the ability to bond across species lines, but the ability to thrive in situations where the rulebook doesn't apply." "Are you proposing to expand the integration program?" Marrow asked, his scientific curiosity clearly piqued. "I'm proposing to revolutionize it." Mace turned to face both alien scientists fully. Instead of just studying how different species can coexist, why not create a training center for beings who've been traumatized, displaced, or who need to learn how to adapt to challenging circumstances? Commander Olin's ears perked up with interest. "A rehabilitation center?" "A survival center," Mace corrected. "Not just for recovery, but for building resilience. These cubs have shown they can identify protective qualities in other species. What if we could teach other beings to develop those same qualities in themselves?" The idea hung in the air between them like a small star being born, bright, warm, and full of potential. "The funding applications alone would be," Olin began. "Approved in a heartbeat," Mace interrupted. "I've seen the reports, Commander. Half the species in this sector are dealing with some form of displacement or adaptation stress. Refugee populations, colony worlds adapting to new environments, even established planets trying to integrate with galactic society. There's a market for what we could offer here." "And you'd run this program?" Marrow asked. "I'd help develop it. These cubs would be the test case. Proof that beings from different species can not only coexist, but can learn to protect and strengthen each other." Mace looked down at the sleeping aliens, his expression thoughtful. "They've already shown me something I didn't know I needed to learn." "Which is?" "That sometimes the best way to heal from trauma isn't to avoid responsibility. It's to take on the right kind of responsibility. These cubs don't need me to be perfect. They need me to be present, consistent, and willing to face whatever challenges come their way alongside them." One of the smaller cubs, the male who had tried to speak Standard Galactic on that first day, opened his eyes and looked directly at Mace. For a moment, Captain and cub regarded each other in perfect understanding. "Welcome home, Captain," the cub said in perfectly clear, if slightly accented, Standard Galactic. The three adults stared at the small alien in shock. "Did he just—" Olin began. "He's been practicing," Mother Hen said without opening her eyes, also in clear Standard. We all have. If we're going to be a pack, we should be able to talk to our alpha properly. How long have you been able to speak standard? Mace asked, crouching down to the cub's level. Since the second day, another cub piped up, this one sporting a distinctive white patch over one eye. But we wanted to make sure you were staying before we showed off. Mace looked up at Commander Olin and Dr. Sindel, both of whom were frantically taking notes on their data pads. Well, Mace said finally, I guess that settles it. Can't abandon a pack that's put that much effort into learning my language. So you'll stay? Mother Hen asked, finally opening her eyes to look at him directly. I'll stay, Mace confirmed. But we're going to do this right. No more emergency lighting as chew toys, no more refusing to eat when I'm in meetings, and definitely no more 3-day sleepless vigils. Agreed, the cubs chorused in perfect unison, their tails wagging with enough enthusiasm to create a small windstorm. Commander Olin watched this exchange with the satisfaction of someone whose administrative problems had just transformed into opportunities for career advancement. I'll start drafting the program proposal tomorrow. Today, actually. Dr. Sindel, I'll need your psychological assessment reports. Already prepared, Merrow replied smugly. I had a feeling Captain Holloway would make the right choice. As the three adults began discussing logistics and the cubs settled back into sleep, the Meridian's Edge sat quietly in its docking berth. It would stay there for now, converted from a cargo transport into a permanent reminder that sometimes the most important destinations were the ones you never planned to reach. And in the growing network of interspecies cooperation that would eventually span dozens of worlds, they would remember this moment as the beginning, when one stubborn human, 12 extraordinary cubs, and 2 dedicated scientists proved that the best families were the ones you chose, regardless of what species they happened to be.